Hello, welcome to A Lesson Before Writing. This is episode 13. In other words, our 1 year anniversary episode. So I don't know, we should have party favors and things, but I don't think we're going to. So I'm Ted Morrissey. I'm here with my co hosts, Brady Harrison. And this is Brady's book, The Term Between, a story collection that won the High Plains Book Award. But we are feverishly working on Brady's novel, actually going through page edits, which we might touch on a bit in this episode. And then also here with Grant Tracy, and this is Grant's most recent release by us, the novel Neon Kiss, a Hayden Fuller novel. And the paperback edition has a great introduction plus a preview to A Shoeshine Kill, an even newer Hayden Fuller novel that we'll be working on. And this is my new book, The Strophes of Job, out recently in paperback. And it's gotten some really great reviews, which I'm grateful for. The paperback edition, I added a brief afterword and then another short story, which was kind of the impetus to this novel, which is a prequel. And then also our friend Ashwin Prasanth and his friend Augustine George, who are professors in India, and they work with 12 Winters Press quite a bit. And they actually interviewed me last year about a bunch of stuff. And so we ended up including the interview in the paperback edition as well. So anyway, that's all out there for folks. So yeah, this is our 13th episode, our 1 year anniversary. So a year ago, Brady was coming to us from Ireland, and now he's back home. And a lot's happened in the last year. I don't know. I mean, kind of looking back, reflecting on the past year, literarily and every other way. What are some of your I don't know, highlights of the past year, or thoughts about life and letters over the past year? I didn't tell you guys I was going to throw you that question, so I'll just give you a second here, but now I'm going to kick it over to Brady. Since I referenced your coming home from Ireland, did that give you a new perspective on American culture and writing, or your teaching of literature after having spent a year on the Emerald Isle teaching, or pretty much the scene you left, you came home to?
No, I would say everything's different. But really complicated questions. Nonetheless, I am very self-consciously wearing some Irish green today. I pulled it out of the closet, especially for the show. Yeah, Ireland's very much on my mind these days. One of the nice things about having been away for years gives you a chance to breathe a little bit, to kind of get out of your mind space and to be somewhere else, some physical space and with new folks. And I think it changes everything. And one of the highlights of that year in Ireland, although I was in Ireland and doing research for a book that I'm hoping to get to pretty soon, the project that I worked on primarily, in addition to some academic articles and the book on Bob Dylan, was I rewrote from the first word to the last word the French novel, the Moroccan novel that Ted referenced a little bit a few moments ago. And so I was in Ireland, but I was also mentally in Paris, and then in the desert south of Morocco. And then to come back, here I am back in Montana, and everything has changed, and the kind of literature that I'm interested in, the kind of work that I've been reading, the kind of work that I've been trying to do. I've tried to absorb that experience and try to make something new, and we'll see. So the research I did for the next, or not the very next project, the project after that, is a novel with strong Irish connections and set in part in Ireland. So yeah, it was transformative. So this year back has been processing all of those experiences. We'll see how it goes.
Cool.
Did I answer the question at all?
Absolutely. Yeah, that was all very interesting. I didn't realize you were thinking of writing a novel set partly in Ireland. That's very cool. Grant, what's your I don't know, what's your take on all that?
Well, I don't know what to say about all that. I just feel like I just kept trudging on doing my thing, It's like I just keep writing stories, keep sending stuff out. I've been in a bit of a creative period right now. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just mortality, thoughts on mortality. I don't know, but I've been doing a ton of writing. Well, I guess in terms of my own work, one I obviously I got the Hayden Fuller novels, but I've been really attracted to the Eddie Sands character, the short stories I've been writing about the cab driver, because I drove cab for a year, and I had a lot of wild adventures, and I always knew someday I would get stories out of them. Um, but I've seen an evolution where I started off those stories on limited third because I wanted the voice to be different from first person detective fiction. And then I found the first person voice fit Eddie perfectly. And then I read a collection of stories by Charles R. Dye, and I seen how he used multiple points of view in the short story format. So that's what I've done with the last two Sand stories I wrote this summer, where there's three different points of view in each of them, all from like big third. But I definitely do that free and direct discourse thing where I'm investing in the space of those different characters, and that's been a lot of fun. It opens the story up in different ways, and so yeah, so I just been experimenting with form, I guess. Oh, and I guess an exciting friend, you guys know I dabble in writing plays too, and a play I wrote is going to have a stage reading at the Cedar Falls Community Theater on September 14th or 15th. They haven't decided. They got a play festival, and they're going to do stage readings of three plays, and mine's one of the three they selected. So it's a gangster story, of course. And it's kind of it owes a lot to Morley Callahan's More Joy in Heaven. It's sort of a story about a bank robber and who finds redemption without dying at the end. So anyway, but
It's not naturalism.
yeah, no, it's not. But yeah, so that's all I got to say about myself. I mean, I just keep chugging along, doing my thing, and reading lots of crime books and being inspired by what I read to keep writing.
Actually, your answers made me think of something else here, which may be worth talking about. Both of you, I know, like Grant, for your one Hayden novel that you want to set in Montreal, you actually went to Montreal and did some ground research there, and then incorporated that into the book. And Brady mentioning that he wants to incorporate some Ireland into his next book since he was in Ireland, and I've had the good fortune in recent years to do quite a bit of travel. And I've just been some really fascinating places. I was in Vietnam a few years ago. In fact, I've been invited back to go this fall. I'm kind of deciding whether I'm going to do that or not. But then we were in Morocco. I love Morocco. And then last summer we were in Mexico, but kind of away from touristy Mexico, which is always my preference. And we were in this valley between these two volcanoes, the volcanoes that Malcolm Lowry writes about in Under the Volcano. Just awesome spectacles, to behold. Anyway, I would love to write stories or something in any of those locations, and I've actually sat down and tried to do it, and it just seems like it's too recent. I just end up writing like travel log. I was trying to write about this Mexican experience, but via fiction, and I'd spent like I don't know, like 2 pages describing what refried beans are like in Mexico versus like what they are in America, because I was fascinated by. Anyway, I just realized I'm just writing terrible fiction whenever I try to write about someplace I've visited recently. I'm confident though that if I can keep writing for the next 20 years, I'll eventually be able to set a story in Vietnam or in Mexico or in Morocco and have it be decent, because enough of the newness of it has worn off that it becomes a sort of fictional place in my imagination. What about that thought? Do you guys ever struggle with, turn your fiction is becoming more like journalism or travel writing because you're too close to the location and the subject matter? I'll come back to you, Brady. Have you ever had that issue, do you think?
Absolutely. I have to, my brain has to process experience for a long time. Right. It's not, it has to be sort of become part or particle of you and deeply woven, I think, in your consciousness and your experience before ideas for stories, at least in my experience, before ideas for stories can emerge from that experience. And so I found early on when I began writing fiction here relatively late in life, or got serious about trying to write fiction late in life, that a lot of my stories were set in Canada. I grew out of although I'd been living in the States, for many, many, many years. And then over the course of writing those short stories, then there was a kind of transition too, where I began to write American stories, experiences that had connections to the life I had lived and the things I had seen and the things that I knew from my experiences in the US. So I think there has to be a kind of percolating time, at least in my experience, that's certainly the case. And because, we don't want to just write postcards about, the food that we had. That's not fiction, right? It's something else. And so I think there will be, I'm pleased to be able to just sit for a year or two with the Irish experience, even as I continue to do research and think through and map out in a not thoroughly Henry James sort of way, but map out the novel after the novel I'm working on now. And so it's growing, but I'm not forcing it. I'm giving it time to breathe and let that experience settle.
Interesting. Yeah, Grant, what about you? I think you were pretty successful in integrating your, firsthand Montreal experiences into fiction, but maybe that hadn't been your very first trip to Montreal when you did the research for the Hayden novel there.
Well,
What's your thought on all that?
It had, but I guess I was gonna kind of borrow from Richard Hugo and Triggering Town, and just like Brady, so much of my early memories are situated in Canada. I lived there till I was 24, and now I've been in the States since then. But I go back, I go to Toronto. I've been in New Brunswick a lot, which I just love. And Montreal is just a fabulous city. But I think if I could retire to Canada, it would be Montreal or Winnipeg.
Montreal for me, no question.
Yeah, I love Montreal. I might even, become a closet Habs fan, but can't give up on the blue and white, But I guess what I'm trying to say is, I do a trick that I've done with the Eddie Sands stories, and I think I've talked about this in other podcasts. But I went to college at Trent University in Ontario, which is in Peterborough, and I drove cab for a year in Peterborough. And at the time, it was 58,000 people. So I took that location of this kind of cottage country place that had a redneck vibe, and I transplanted that into Winsome, which is an imaginary city that I created in upstate New York, which combines my trips to Watertown as a kid and also Seneca Falls and places like that, and Webster City, Iowa. So there's like this weird, like there's an armory that I took from Webster City, Iowa, and then there's streets that are from Peterborough, but there's an American vibe. So it's like a Canadian-American hybrid, even though the character's an American. He served in the Korean War. Well, I had an uncle who was an American who fought in the Korean War. He was a radio guy, and later was stationed in Iceland, and then later became a tax guy, IRS guy, which happens to a lot of ex-military, I guess. So I guess what I'm saying is I was able to take an experience and to get some distance from it, and to allow myself. I remember Hugo saying something like, if you write about a real place and the barn's black, you're going to make it black. Like, you're going to have a hard time making it a yellow barn. And because I'm able to, I don't quite buy that, but I just use it as an example. So I've got Peterborough in my mind, but I can do whatever I want because Winsome's a fictional place. So for me, it's exciting to work through it that way, if that makes sense. And Toronto for me is the Toronto before 1984, I guess. I mean, it's the Toronto I grew up in, but it's a much different city now. It's too much for me. I go back there and it's super crowded, too much, just too much. I have no desire to live there. I like visiting, but like Montreal's my kind of speed. It's cool. You can go for a stroll in the evenings. The old
When I
Montreal, just gorgeous, and quiet.
when I go to Vancouver, it's overwhelming
Yes.
because we become such country mice, Grant,
I know.
living in
I'm
college
used to.
towns.
I can ride to work in 7 minutes. I don't take the GO train, and it takes me an hour to get to work and an hour to get home to the suburbs. No, thank you. And and the price in the city is so expensive. I mean, yeah, Montreal, no, and I love smoked meat. So there you go, and bagels. So what can I say?
Yeah, I suppose the ultimate example of what we're talking about here may be James Joyce, who left Ireland, left Dublin, and spent pretty much his entire adulthood in other countries, but yet always wrote about Dublin. He always returned. There's no stories or anything set in Zurich or in Trieste or wherever, so he was always writing from his mind. Although interestingly, Joyce was really focused on trying to get Dublin right in terms of, whenever he wrote about location, he wanted everything to be exactly correct. Whereas I tend to, I'm pretty loosey goosey. When I write about a real place, oftentimes it's more of an I imply it's a real place or what real place it is, but I don't necessarily commit, so I can, play with the details a little bit as needed or whatever. But yeah, that's interesting. The fact that our experiences, for a lot of us at least, have to, sort of percolate, as Brady says, or incubate or something before we can kind of turn them successfully into fiction. I think of someone, we keep referencing Hemingway in this podcast as if we are all diehard Hemingway fans. I know that isn't necessarily the case, but Hemingway, on the other hand, he felt like he needed to go and experience big game hunting in Africa before he could write about big game hunting in Africa, or go experience bullfighting in Spain before he could write about bullfighting in Spain, and so he had a whole different mindset regarding needing that distance or whatever. I don't know, maybe it's just a psychological thing or the style of writing he was doing, which kind of always teetered on the brink of journalism, even when he was writing fiction or something. So maybe that makes a bit of a difference, but I don't know, any further thoughts or afterthoughts on that that whole topic?
I feel like being in place is crucial. Like you can always one can imagine a place, one can create a place, but the kind of I don't know if it's the old Raymond Williams part of the structure of feeling that I find I only have confidence if I have been a place and experienced it in some measure. And then just as Ted says, then you can reshape it in whatever way you want. But for me, like I couldn't have written about the Sahara without going. I couldn't write about Paris without being a lot in Paris. I mean, that was terrible. It was unbearable, to have that experience of time in Paris. But yeah, I gotta have the feeling of the place for me anyway.
Well, I've been working with some MFA students this summer on their final thesis projects, and some really interesting things that they're working on. One of the students, I don't want to give obviously a whole lot of details here, but they had a really traumatic experience in their past, and so their final project was a memoir, basically, of this terrible event they went through, and then the aftermath of it, and so forth. And it really was, really heart-wrenching and terrible and pain. I mean, physically and emotionally painful. But they wrote about it in such a blasé, matter-of-fact way. I think because they lived it, and so they're just basically giving almost like a recounting of, well, this happened on this day, and then this happened on the next day, and then we had this kind of therapy and that. And even though the source of this writing was this horrific experience, because they were approaching it just purely as memoir, they really weren't bringing out any sort of dramatic element in what is inherently a dramatic, and that's one of the things we've been talking about. It's like, well, and it gets difficult because, when you're trying to give feedback on someone's trauma, you don't want to say, oh, C plus on your trauma. You want to obviously be sympathetic to their experience, but at the same time, from a writing standpoint, you recognize that there really isn't a lot of narrative energy in this. And how do we do that? How do we inject fictional like narrative energy into a memoir, which is determined to be legitimate and true and so forth? And that's really, really tough. Obviously, Truman Capote kind of, pioneered in some regards that approach with his, nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood and that kind of thing. But anyway, I don't know. Have you run into that with students or in your own experiences where, the thing you're writing about is inherently dramatic and emotional and tragic and all that, but yet it's hard to bring out those elements when you're just sticking to the facts?
Yeah.
I know, Grant, you've worked with, oh, go ahead. Yeah, Grant, I'm sure you've run into
I
that.
have, and it's tricky because, like, in creative nonfiction, you're supposed to tell the truth. And in fiction, you tell an emotional truth. And so one of the things, and of course, there's emotional truths to creative nonfiction too. But my point is, I often tell students when they're writing fiction, you have to write for the story first, not for the experience. And the story has its own rules, and the story might force you to make different choices than what really happened, and allow for those choices. Now, for the person writing creative nonfiction and fiction, I would also say, if you already know the lesson to be learned, find something else as you're working on it. Find a hidden truth. Find something in the shadows that you weren't even aware of. And I often find, for me, when I'm writing fiction, I think I've got something figured out, like, 2/3 of the way through the story, and then something surprises me, and I run with that and allow the mystery of life to present me with those wonderful accidents. And so Ron Carlson said, don't write what you know, write toward what you know. Because if you write what you know, then the narrative's overdetermined. If you write toward what you know, you'll discover something new and exciting. And I think that's what I teach my students anyway. And I think that's a good distinction to make.
Yeah, yeah. Brady, what are your thoughts on that issue?
Oh, well, in truth, as you were both, and over the course of our conversations and the podcast, I have put some thought into what it must, and I have wondered what it must be like as you are teaching creative writing, teaching fiction on the one hand, but then teaching, running a nonfiction class, and the kinds of experiences that students bring and that they want to explore. And so I was sort of taking shelter in my much cozier scholarly life, where what I want is, hard-edged, perceptive, deep thinking, analytical work with a text, with Louise Erdrich, with Toni Morrison, with their reading of Hemingway. And so in some ways, I feel like I've not had to confront a lot of people's personal experiences that I think must come out in creative writing classes. So I guess I'm in a cowardly way, I guess I'm grateful for that.
Well, and I wonder too, Ted, if that example you gave, like the Romantic poets, and I'm sorry, I'm not the scholar that Brady is. Brady, you're amazing. I got to say, when I read that piece on Hills Like White Elephants that you did for 12 Winters, amazing stuff. How you
Thanks,
tied
Ted.
so many other critical voices and stuff. But I don't know how to explain. I'll come back to it. I'm still grappling with this idea of honesty and voice. I'll come back to my point later.
Well, one of my reactions to that situation and other similar situations I've found myself in pedagogically is that creative nonfiction is called that, and it's not just called nonfiction. In other words, if you're writing creative nonfiction, you have the opportunity to be creative, and you don't have to write what comes off as kind of a police report or something about what happened to you. That
Right.
there are all kinds of ways that you can get at the truth of the matter and be accurate, but also be creative. And in my experimental writing course that I teach, several of the pieces that I ask the students to read are creative nonfiction based on real life events of the author, rape, horrific, accidents, things like that. And yet they use the medium to be very, very creative in the way that they tell their story, mixing genres, chopping up the narrative into pieces and rearranging it, integrating graphic elements into their story. And so that's one of the ways I approach it, that if you're doing creative nonfiction, don't forget about the first half of that, and allow yourself to be creative even while you are telling a truth and sticking to the facts, etc. You can still do that in creative, interesting ways.
And maybe like, the Romantic poets talked about the poetic form and meter as a way to control emotion. At least that's what I remember from when I was a grad student studying Romantic poetry. And so you have this intense emotional reaction, and then to put it on with some restraint, you use meter and form to help control that. And I'm wondering if this student, the trauma is so that it's almost like a Hemingway thing, where she or he are underplaying the moment because it's so ripe, it's so traumatizing, triggering, and they need to be able to give themselves permission to tell the story in a way in which they can invest in that feeling. But because it re-triggers things, they have to have that kind of detachment. And so that could be just something that comes with time and therapy or whatever. I don't know, but I mean, I can sort of understand the desire to kind of use flat prose because it's just too much to relive. But I feel like I got to share it. But this is the best way I can do it at where I'm at emotionally right now. That's just a thought, just throwing it out there.
Well, one of the techniques I've recommended writers try, I didn't necessarily recommend it in this case, and I've tended to talk about it in more like essay length work and not whole book length work. But and I take the example from Gertrude Stein and the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, written by actually Gertrude Stein, where the convention is that Gertrude Stein is writing, and she's writing about herself, but she's pretending to be her lifelong companion, writing about her lifelong companion, Gertrude Stein. So in other words, I encourage students to think about, well, what if you write about yourself, but write about your experience as if you are the third person in this, and you're being, and so the voice is that of maybe someone who was close to you or whatever. And how does that change the narrative? I mean, you're still writing about you and the experience, but now you're outside yourself, viewing, and it can be pretty successful if students can get into that mindset of writing about themselves but via some other persona. I don't know. Does that make any sense? Have you ever tried that? Have you ever recommended anyone try that? Any other examples of that kind of thing being done by other authors? Brady, any thoughts on that technique? Or
Grant?
Well, I was going to say yes.
Yes,
Lifeline?
I do have a side story that I might tell in a minute, but I'm going to just defer.
I'll keep it really short, so we can get to the side story here, pal. Yeah, I think I love that example, Ted, and it kind of dovetails into the story we're going to talk about later today. But a technique I like to do is to make. I like the F. Scott Fitzgerald Great Gatsby technique, where you make the character, if you're really basing something on yourself, you make yourself Jay Gatsby and tell the story from Nick, who's like a peripheral narrator who's viewing this sort of character that does all this wild and flashy stuff, but it really is Nick's story. At least in my opinion, it's Nick's story. I mean, I guess it's both, but I'm a big fan of Nick. So that would be I love the technique, and I think that's another way to do what you were talking about, Ted. That's a great move, though, to get students to be able to explore something, but give it some narrative distance. Brady, you're on the air.
Yep. Take it away.
Oh, well,
Side
this
story.
is well, no, it's a connection to Gertrude Stein. So I had the good fortune to spend a month in Paris, and I love Paris, and been working all my life on French, which I still struggle with, and so deeply resent my trilingual daughter. So one of the pilgrimages that I undertook, and my friend was visiting me, and so we went to Père Lachaise, and when we were wandering around, we did the obligatory things, like we went to Jim Morrison's grave, which is sort of tucked and sort of filthy, and Père Lachaise is a wreck, and it's kind of except for the Holocaust memorials, a lot of it is of the cemeteries in deep disrepair. And so we went by Oscar Wilde's grave site, and it's it has been vandalized, and so it's behind a plastic barrier. But we also went, and it took a while to find because the phones weren't working. We went to Gertrude Stein's grave site, and Alice is beside her. And so we noticed in the way of Père Lachaise that the gravesite was pretty neglected. And so without really talking about it, or even sort of at first understanding what we were doing, we weeded, we pulled the weeds out of Gertrude Stein's grave. Like we cleaned it up. We cleaned up both of the sites, and I've been so puzzled by that experience ever since. Like, what am I doing? What does it mean to do that? So I have no theory on trauma. I have this notion of writing about someone else about yourself through a kind of different lens of some other consciousness. I think that's all great, and I think we probably all do that quite a bit. But what I was thinking when you were talking about Gertrude Stein was this experience that has puzzled me ever since. Yeah, the day we weeded Gertrude Stein's grave in Paris.
Well, see, that makes perfect sense to me. You probably spent an entire lifetime wishing you could weed Gertrude Stein's prose to clean it up and make it more accessible. And here you had an opportunity to physically weed her grave or what. You got somehow someday turn that into some sort of a story. That's a great. You've got your ending already somehow. I think you just got to figure out how to get there narratively or whatever. But I didn't realize that she and Alice were in the same cemetery as Jim
side
Morrison.
by side.
Wow. That's really interesting.
I mean, it's such a chaotic place, and the graves are all but on top of one another, and the little mausoleums and crypts are all several of them are falling down, and trees growing up through them, and I mean the place is just a wreck. It's oddly neglected, or whatever the case. But yeah, it's full of history. And then on one of the edges, as I mentioned, there are a number of Holocaust memorials, and they just, of course, knock you down. You see the visceral nature of them. Yeah, so I mean, forget about the Lizard King. They put up barriers, but people it's just like it's like a dirty street corner. That's it's just sort of overworn, and bottle caps and plastic flower. It's just a crap place. But other parts of Père Lachaise, there's amazing history. Anyway, I'm nattering on. I'm losing all our threads.
Well, I think I'm going to move us along towards our eventual discussion of our featured story. And but your talking about Gertrude Stein reminded me. Years and years ago, I published a little literary journal, A Summer's Reading, and we published. Well, I always talk in the plural. It's probably a psychological element, but I published, 7 issues over 7 years. And one of my favorite stories that I published was a story that had Gertrude and Alice as the main characters, and it was a little mystery story about that they were summering somewhere in France, and their next door neighbor shoots himself. He's an ex-military officer, and Gertrude and Alice don't believe that it was a suicide. So there's this whole little mystery story about, but it's written, in Gertrude Stein-esque prose. And so it's just really, really fun. But anyway, it's a type of revisionist fiction, which is what I wanted us to kind of talk about.
Ed,
And
do you know who
sorry.
wrote that? Who wrote that piece? Do you know?
It was a couple of sisters who wrote under a singular pen name, Perry O'Shaughnessy, and
Okay.
they actually wrote a bunch of mysteries. But they sent this to me and to A Summer's Reading, the literary journal, because this was something they wrote that was very literary. Most of their mysteries were more cozy. They had regular series that they wrote. But they were two sisters. Unfortunately, I can't remember their individual names, but like one was Perry, and then their last names was O'Shaughnessy or something. But Perry O'Shaughnessy, I think, was the pen name that the two sisters wrote under. But anyway, it's really. I think they eventually did a short story collection, and it was included in that, if I remember correctly. But so revisionist fiction. This is very near and dear to my heart. Revisionist fiction, as I define it, is when someone writes an original piece of fiction, but it is inspired by some other usually well-known, I guess it has to be well-known piece of fiction, classic fiction. It might be a prequel, it might be a sequel, it might be telling the same story from a different character's perspective. I mean, there's all ways that could kind of manifest itself. And like I said, this has been a particular interest of mine for a long time. I teach a couple different classes in revisionist fiction for the university I teach in the MFA program. In fact, this summer earlier, I did my Shakespeare revisionist course where we read 3 Shakespeare plays, and then after each one, we read a contemporary novel inspired by that play, including one by Margaret Atwood and Jeanette Winterson and so forth. And then I teach another more kind of general revisionist course for the university where we read one of my favorites, Beowulf, the old Anglo-Saxon poem, and a couple of novels based on that. And then we read the New Testament, and we read some novels based on, inspired by New Testament stories. But anyway, I call it revisionist fiction. Some people like to use the term fan fiction as sort of synonymous. I tend to see them as being a little bit different, and I think of revisionist fiction as being a little higher brow. But I know Jim O'Loughlin, your colleague at Iowa, Northern Iowa, Grant, he writes what I call revisionist fiction, revisionist Vonnegut fiction. He tends to call it fan fiction, but so the term is pretty fluid. And you were saying, Grant, that you had never really heard that term in that way, and you think of it differently. What you want to talk a little bit about how you view that whole approach?
Yeah, I guess I don't usually take I don't do a prequel or a sequel, but I don't want to take up a lot of time here because you guys are the experts on this. But a long time ago, the first story in my first collection with you, Ted, Turnstiles, was my deliberate revision. I call it scaffolding, like I borrowed from, but I took a John Cheever story called Family Dinner, which was published in the 1940s, where Cheever hadn't discovered who Cheever is yet. He had yet to discover his narrative telling voice. So it was a very iceberg story. And the premise was a couple goes to visit the in-laws and pretends to still be married, even though they're separated and they're going to get a divorce. And then there's this whole big dinner and all this stuff goes on. And at the end, the last line is something like they never saw each other again. They get on a separate train or whatever. And I just remember thinking, okay, how would Cheever have written this story in the 50s when he was doing all those great, short stories of his, 50s and 60s? Or how can I borrow some of this, but change it so it's not kind of a waspy, suburban crowd? So I used Macedonian ethnicity and Romany background to sort of give this story, because there was a reference to gypsies in Cheever's story, which wasn't offensive, but I found it like, you're just sort of gazing here at gypsy culture. It was a passing reference. So I was like, I'm going to put some, because, I have some of that blood running through my veins. And so I decided I was going to do something with that. And And I didn't like the overdetermined quality to Cheever's story. I knew from the beginning how it was going to end. So I wanted to create a narrative that created more doubt, more questions, and left things open at the end. I don't know what that word is that you were using in your piece, Brady, about Jig at the end of Feels Like White Elephants, like what is she going to do? But that's what I wanted for the ending of my story. As I was writing it, I suddenly had an idea, and it might have been I was thinking Hills Like White Elephants. I don't know, but I want it to be open-ended, not overdetermined. And so yeah, so basically inspired by Cheever, I took some of the variables that were in Cheever's story and then mixed them up, changed them, and then wrote my own story. So I don't know if that's revisionist. I just know like it's built on another story. So that's, and I've done that a lot. Like I've got another short story where I take a scene, just a scene out of, it's about a son whose father dies of a heart attack, and he goes to the apartment that his father stayed in, and he's trying to find something of a legacy, something that his dad left behind for him, because his dad didn't leave anything. And the son falls asleep in a chair and smells the perfume and wakes up, and there's this beautiful woman in her early 30s who's there. And I stole that right out of Laura, where Mark McPherson's investigating a case and he falls in love with a portrait, and then this woman shows up, who's not dead after all. And in my story, the woman that shows up was teaching Hemingway and other stories to the father. That's the father loved books. He wanted to learn to appreciate English because he spoke Macedonian and didn't have this ability. And that was something he was learning. He was paying her. And then the two of them became lovers, and that becomes part of it. And at the end, the legacy that's handed down, there's an overdue library book, which I took from Bernard Malamud's story, A Summer's Reading, by the way, which, name your journal. And I love that short story, by the way. And at the end of the piece, the kid says, no, I'll take it back to the library. And it ends with them sitting down in a chair, opening the book and reading the stories that his dad was reading. And that is lifted from the ending to Malamud's A Summer's Reading, where this kid promises to read 100 books over the summer, doesn't do shit, and at the end goes to the library, sits down, opens a book, and starts reading. So so for me, it's more like, rappers and borrowing a riff from, an Aerosmith song or something. That's how I think of it. But I know there's it's on my reading list. I haven't read it yet, but James, it's on deck. I'm going to be reading that soon. The Huck Finn story told from Jim's perspective. But now I'm going to shut up and let you two pros go at it.
Well, fun fact: it was the Malamud story was the inspiration for the title of my literary journal. Yeah, because I love that story too. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, I read that when I was in high school. There was a unit on youth and maturity, and that was one of 4 stories. There was a Callahan story. Callahan's story, all the years of her life, Paul's Case by Willa Cather, Malamud's Summer's Reading, and then a story by Steinbeck, where a daughter doesn't want to go see her father. I can't remember the title of it, but it's in Steinbeck's The Long Valley collection. So yeah, that's fantastic, Ted. Love that. And I've actually got a crime story I've been working on that sort of borrows from that's directly connected to it. It's called Another Summer's Reading. But anyway.
Nice. So Brady, what obviously your Hemingway piece we've alluded to a couple times is very much, in my mind at least, a revisionist piece. What are some of your thoughts on that technique or that genre?
Yeah, well, I think, in just listening to the conversation, I think there's a whole range. Like I think of the White Hills of Ebro as in conversation, and so that's the model, the model from poetry, the idea of conversation pieces where you write back against, and there's that long tradition in poetry where a poem will become famous and other poets will punch back and try to outfox them and write a greater work. It's in direct conversation with the original poem. It's in response to conversation pieces. So I think that's one model. But then there's the way that Grant has just been talking. There's a scene or a moment in a story that it inspires a whole other, and it's not sort of directly in conversation. Nonetheless, it grows from it, scaffolds on that earlier experience. And so the novel that my novel that Ted's bringing out is based and grows out of, but it's not in conversation with it. It tries to be its own thing, but it's based in the reading I had done of a lot of travel logs, a lot of travel writing, a lot of the experiences of sort of compulsive, people who couldn't help themselves but to keep going one more step towards some unknown, potentially dangerous place. And so the novel has as its structure, its understructure, its scaffold, and it's built upon these earlier narratives, and then it riffs on them in some of the ways that both of you have been suggesting. So I think there's a whole spectrum of ways to respond to literary work, including this rather amazing
Yes.
and delightful story that's a head spinner if there ever was one. Yeah, so there's any number of ways to be in conversation or in response, or yeah, and then I'll keep going. Just one more point. My daughter's like a lot of her generation grew up on Harry Potter, and she loves the fan fiction. And these are not, these are beyond the canon, and so there's just folks out there, in the internet world publishing these 500, 700-page novels of the Harry Potter world, using the Harry Potter characters and filling in gaps that they perceive in Rowling's overall narrative. So there's a million ways to respond, it seems like.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you guys have both used musical terms, and I often use that metaphor with students, especially students who take my courses, but they aren't familiar with the concept, or they actually discover they have been familiar with it, but they just didn't think of it in that way. But the idea that if you do a revision of Hemingway or whatever it might be, it's not because you see flaws in the original that you're trying to fix, but rather you love the original in most cases, and it's like a band that's doing a cover version of a song that they love. It's not because they think they can do it better than the Grateful Dead or Fleetwood Mac or whoever it is. They just love it, so they kind of want to put their own little mark on it. So they kind of put a personal spin on it or whatever. And I think revisionist fiction for me, certainly as a writer, but I think in general terms, is what a lot of writers do. It gives them an opportunity to just really dive in and live with and love a particular work, a particular character. I'll just say, I got the screen real quickly. The majority of my work in fiction has been revisionist. My first novel, Men of Winter, is a sequel to Homer's Odyssey, but set in early 20th century Siberia, of all things. My novel, Untimely Frost, is a working on the idea of Washington Irving and Mary Shelley meeting in London and having this sort of romantic relationship, which is based on fact. I take a lot of liberties. Weeping with an Ancient God is a retelling of Melville's Typee, that kind of thing. But my favorite book so far that I've written, which is revisionist, is Mrs. Seville. Frankenstein is a book that I've really been influenced by, partly because I taught it for a decade, a couple decades, and I would read it aloud to my students. I love Mary Shelley's prose. It is so florid and magnetic. It really wormed its way into my psyche. And so one of the things I got to thinking about was, if you're familiar with the novel Frankenstein, it's really one long letter from this guy named Robert Walton to his sister, Margaret Seville. And she's mentioned at the beginning of the novel, and the novel just kind of flows from it. And we know nothing about Margaret Seville. She lives in London. She's married, obviously, because she has a different last name than the main character, or Robert Walton. And she's worried about her brother. That's it. That's all we get. And so I thought, what's her story? So I wrote a novel, about Mrs. Seville and gave her own narrative. And I just really enjoyed that process and so on. But yeah, I love that idea that it's sort of a riff on the original and not trying to replace it or one-upsmanship like Brady kind of mentioned a minute ago or whatever. Yeah. We could kind of transition into our story unless you guys have any more general kind of comments you want to throw in there.
I just had a general question, and maybe we probably talked about this on another podcast, but it might be worth going over again. How do you, there's a line in the story we're going to be looking at where a character makes a passing reference to something about Poe being obsessed with whiteness, but it's not said that way. It's said much more subtly. And it's almost like the character saying it isn't aware of the double voice quality. Like, in other words, yeah, he's kind of hung up on this stuff, but there's a way in which we readers get Yeah, he's a racist. You know, Poe's got some things he needed to work through. But like when we go to those earlier texts, there's we have blind spots today, you know, that 20 years from now we'll look back on and, you know, sort of like, oh my God, why did we say those kinds of things? So how do you as a writer have that awareness, that double voice awareness of like in a Hayden Fuller story, I can't have Hayden in the 1960s say, I apologize for my gender. You know, that's that's something somebody in 2024 could say about masculinity, right? Toxic masculinity. I can't have Hayden going off on talk. Those are our catch buzzwords. But how do you show that awareness of like that whiteness comment that's in Meola's story? That I just wanted to ask you about that, Ted, because I'm sure you navigate that in your
Well,
work.
it's tricky because like in my novel Untimely Frost, there are a couple of characters, a brother and a sister, who are really the most intelligent, most interesting characters in the book in many ways, but I make them people of color, you know. And in the novel is set in like 1830, so you know I use the term negress, for example, you know, one time, you know, because the main character, that's how he describes the sister or whatever. So I try to insert it in there, but not like overdo it, you know, not keep coming back to it. Another interesting one I ran into was my novel Crow Song for the Stricken is not revisionist per se, but it's set in about 1957. And I've got this story, Erebus, where this couple comes into a cafe, and eventually this black couple comes in and she's pregnant, about to give birth, and there's a snowstorm and they got lost in the snowstorm, couldn't get to the hospital, blah blah blah. And so in the characters' minds they refer to them as Negroes because that would have been the term in 1957. Well, when I finally found a journal to publish that story, the editor was a little about using even that term, you know, that term. And I said, well, the story is set in 1957, and she didn't know that. She goes, well, how are we supposed to know that? I said, well, you know, they're sitting in a cafe listening to a prize fight on the radio, you know, but which happens to be a real prize fight. I don't expect most people to know that, but it's, you know, it was an actual prize fight from 1957. But, you know, just other details. And then, of course, one of the details is they use the term Negro, you know, so it's sort of self-referential. And so what we decided to do, what she was comfortable doing, was putting 1957 at the beginning of the story to kind of ground the reader in terms of where we're at or whatever. But it's tricky, you know, because we do tend to use our contemporary sensibilities about language, about representation. But if we're writing about a historical time period, it, you know, it's very obviously inaccurate if people are not using terminology and expressing viewpoints and opinions that would have been prevalent in that time period. But it
Yeah,
does get tricky.
when I was an undergrad, you know, I studied American history. I'm a joint English history major, and I love history. But one of the books we used in the course was called Negro Thought in America, and it had been published, I think, in the early '60s. So the term black hadn't become the new standard yet. So, and they had essays and excerpts by W.B. Du Bois and you know, Booker T, Washington, and others. But that was and it was put up by, I think, Ann Arbor Press in Michigan. I might be wrong about that, but that was the title of the collection of essays.
Right, right. Brady, you know, you mentioned Agatha Christie from time and again, and one of her books is really an interesting study in that one of her mysteries was originally titled 10 Little N-Words, and then that became, you know, politically incorrect. So then it was reissued eventually, I think, as 10 Little Indians, and that eventually became politically incorrect. So then it was reissued as something. I think they dropped the 10 little aspects of it. But you know
And then there were none.
Yeah,
was that what it eventually became?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
And
that was
so
you got to give credit to the American editors there. That was they were ahead of the curve there. It was published in the UK. I'm sorry, my wife's doing this article on Christie right now, so I'm kind of steeped in hearing her talk about it. But
cool.
it was published in the UK as 10 Little N-Word. And then the American publisher was like, no, we're not doing that. And then wasn't happy with 10 Little Indians either. And then they went with, and then there were none. So, and American publishers have a long tradition. Like, this is a good tradition of cleaning up some of her stuff. Like we always think of, revising writers after they're dead, but they were actually at the time of publication cleaning up some of the anti-Semitism. It's all over the place.
The anti-Semitism will wear you out.
It does. I mean, anyway, I'm not going to bag an egg for Christie. I'm obviously a hard-boiled guy, not a Christie fan, but it's all over the place in her work.
Well,
But
you referenced James. Is it Percival Everett? Is that the author? Who?
Yes.
Well, I just watched a film last week, American Fiction, which is based on one of his earlier books, I believe. And the main character is a black professor, and he's talking about a book. I don't think it's Conrad's The N-Word of the Narcissus, but it's a title that has the N-word in it. And one of his woke students is objecting to him having that word on the board. And he's like, well, I'm okay with it. She's white, why are you having a problem? So they get in this argument because she wants him to erase the word. And he's like, I'm perfectly comfortable with it. So why do you have a problem with it? Anyway, it's the opening scene of the movie. And it's a really interesting book about the, similar. I mean, that's not all it's about, but certainly the issue of race identity, how we perceive black authors versus white authors, et cetera, et cetera. A bunch of really interesting issues that are brought up in that movie, and I'm sure are also in the novel that it's based on. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and do it. We're our regular viewers and listeners know that. By the way, Brady, I have you to blame for an edit from one of a recent review that I wrote. You tend to use the word auditor for some reason. Maybe it's Canadian. I don't know. So I was writing about this book, a book review, and I thought, I'll be fancy and use Brady's word auditors. And eventually the editor came back and said, why don't we just call them audience? Okay. But so I blame you for that. But anywho, our regular auditors know that we have a featured story every month, and this one is a little different than what we've done before. It's in that revisionist mode. It's in a journal titled Azure, and a journal of literary thought, and really interesting stuff in here. And this in particular is a story by Frank Meola, maybe. And I'll say a little more about Frank in a few minutes here, but it's The Looking Glass of Arthur Gordon Pym. And so it's a revisionist work of that Poe novel, at least, if not more than that. But I'll just read a little bit from the beginning here, and then, we'll kind of jump in here. So, again, this is from Azure, a journal of literary thought. I think 2022, although I received it more recently than that. But it starts off with the date line, New York, New-York, August 1838, and it begins. It is with some reluctance but compelling need that I set pen to paper once again on the subject of my recent voyage into the Southern Pacific Ocean and the narrative relation of it, first published in the Southern Literary Messenger under the name of Edgar Allan Poe. Mr. Poe, editor of that publication, learned of my adventures and encouraged me to set them down, trusting that my awkwardness of style would testify to the veracity of my account. But I was hesitant. I did not believe I could write from memory a description that would convince the reader. Poe therefore suggested he himself write the narrative or a part thereof and publish it in the magazine as fiction. This ruse would demonstrate that the story's facts would be believed by the public even though presented to them as fiction. And indeed, this is what occurred. The narrative was taken by many as truth. Consequently, I decided to write my own description of the entire adventure as fact, all caps, there being evidently no danger of the public not believing it was all true. So the premise here is that the story we know as the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, Poe's only novel-length publication, although it's a short novel, was in fact a true event, but then Poe fictionalized it. And so, at least in the beginning of this story, the narrative voice, the narrator, is the actual person who experienced those strange things in the Pacific Ocean and then eventually wrote about them. But there's this conflict between Poe's sort of overtaking the narrative and overtaking even the author's identity and kind of pushing him more and more to the side. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in this story about he's feeling more and more kind of pushed off to the side and as if he doesn't exist because his authorial, persona has sort of taken over. There's all kinds of twists and turns in the narrative, which we can certainly get into, but I just want to kind of give a brief sort of, description of what the basic idea of this story is. So it's revisionist because it begins with that Poe narrative and then creates this fictional situation based on the origin of that narrative and its publication and so on. So I'm going to stop talking and see what you all have to say about that. Brady, maybe I'll kick it over to you first of all about your reactions to The Looking Glass of Arthur Gordon Pym by Frank Meola.
Well, this was thanks, Ted. This is a great story. My head's still spinning. Grant, I wonder if you had the same experience. So I'm going to be like Grant. We're just going to defer to Ted in all of this since you're much more up to speed on Poe. But this story is so well written. It's so well staged. It's a kind of tiny masterpiece of slipperiness and ironic takes on narrative telling and the reliability of anybody's story or anybody's claims to have actual knowledge or something that they can speak to. Yeah, so I'll say it here at the beginning. I haven't as big a fan as I am of Poe and have read, I believe, all of his short stories. I have never read this novel. I don't know if I've been saying it or if anyway, so I started reading it this morning. But yeah, this is a terrific, as I say, a masterpiece of and it's not like I won't use the term metafiction because so much metafiction is just so awful. The kind of John Barth school. John Barth school. Yeah, this does it in such a great way. Anyway, I'll stop nattering. Lovely story, keeps spinning, brilliantly written, deep knowledge of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
Grant, your thoughts?
A hoot. I mean, I was like just charmed by it, I guess. And I don't want to give stuff away because spoilers, I want.
Well, let's give them away a little bit at least. We can go further. I think to really talk about. I think we need to.
Okay, well, one of the things the question I asked when I got done with it, well, it ended up feeling like a Poe story. If that not that that's a criticism, but here's this guy that's fighting for his own agency, his own space, saying his persona has been taken over by the author. And I often wonder as a writer, when my parents told me stories and I used them for fiction, am I somehow colonizing or whatever word you want to use their experience? They gave me permission to do it, but there's always something a little bit guilty about it, even though I did it. There were stories, there's about 4 or 5 stories I published that were ones that my mom and dad passed down to me. And so there's that fight between Pym, the person, and Pym, the construction by Poe. And then Poe wants to get Pym, the person, to disappear so that the construction becomes the person. That's like mind-blowing, kind of thing. But the point I'm getting to is it feels like a Poe story because we later find out he's in an asylum. And I'm like, with respect to Poe, like, that's why I'm wearing my White Sox gear today, because they're having one of the worst seasons in the history of baseball. This is a horror story, but I love the White Sox. They're my boys. So yeah, I loved that turn. And then this other character that comes in who says, hey man, I don't know what this cat's talking about, but yeah, we ate human flesh. I mean, we had no choice, and I'm like, like, so then it's like, I love prismatic narratives, like what Faulkner does, the movie Rashomon, where you have an event and then you have all these different perspectives, and there just seems to be all these kaleidoscopic perspectives on the story, and it just keeps surprising me. And even the voice, when you're reading it, it sounds like 19th century fiction to me, like right from the get-go. Like the author has put himself in that position of, not just, and this isn't a slam on PD James, because I think she's a hell of a writer, but I don't think she gets Austen's voice right in the work that she did about Pemberley and all that. Doesn't quite get it right. There's other writers that have done Raymond Chandler, and surprisingly, Robert Parker got it right. I think John Banville gets it right, but some of the other writers I've read, and I'm not going to mention the names of those I don't think get it right. Don't get it right. That's all I'm trying to say. But this just feels like it could be part of a Poe collection. So there's just so many things working here. I really have no question, like no criticisms of the piece. I was just like pleasantly surprised and kept reading and was kind of blown away by the narrative turns. It's really a fun piece.
Well, I think that's one of the joys in my mind of doing revisionist fiction, especially if you set it in the past and you're modeling it after an author, from a previous time period. Because we do speak and write differently now in the 21st century than they did in the 19th century or the early 20th, or in England versus the way we. And so, like my Untimely Frost, the main character is based on Washington Irving, and it's the first person narrator. And so I tried to mimic Washington Irving's prose style, and it was great fun. I mean, one of the things I did was buy a copy of his published letters, and there was like my constant companion it took me years to write that novel, like 5 years. And so I kept that literally next to me, at least when I was home, all the time. And when I would get up in the morning, I'd read a few letters just to get that voice in my head. And then I'd just read it several times a day. And it just really worked its way into my psyche, to the point where when I was like writing emails and stuff, I probably sounded like Washington Irving. It's like, what's wrong with this guy, But that was great fun. And then when my novel Mrs. Seville, which I mentioned, which is a sequel to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but tries to give Margaret Seville her own story, I channeled Mary Shelley's prose and tried to write the entire novel as if it was published in that same time period. Again, it was just great fun. I just really, really enjoyed it. I find that I can drift into that 19th century florid voice much more easily than I can contain my voice when I'm trying to write contemporary stuff. It's like my natural medium or something like that. But well, let me turn over to Brady on that thought, because your novel we have coming out, you obviously take on first-person narrative personas. How did you get in the zone to write those different voices?
Yeah, no, I'm just loving this. It's so much fun to listen to you guys talk, and this story is so great. Yeah, well, and I'll just say, just as a quick aside, because I can never stay focused and always have to go sideways. I try not to write any emails or memos or do any chair business when I'm teaching Tristram Shandy, because because stern style, right? Like, sort of like all these clauses and embedded things, and who knows what he's talking about. So yeah, I like Ted, what you're saying so well, that when the historical figures that are the ones I use and revise. And so my characters, based on these historical figures, have very little to do with those historical figures. They become characters, and they're other kinds of things, even though they might share names with those actual historical figures. But in the process of reading, say, D.H. Lawrence's letters and reading his fiction. And so, yeah, so there's a way which try not to mimic it in a way that like people do bad Hemingway, but rather to absorb it and have some of those cadences and some of the particular peculiar terms that are not our terms, not our way of describing things. And so wherever I could, in any of the first person instances in the novel, tried to bring their cadence, their language, their perceptions, even as Grant said earlier, because all of this is still all filtered through our consciousness, and we can't get out of our time, and the past is somewhere different, and they think and perceive things, and so our consciousness, that double voicedness, still creeps in, but I think that's part of what makes it so much fun, as indeed this story in picking up not only sort of Poe's some of the rhythms of Poe's language, but also the slipperiness of his characters. I mean, yeah. So yeah, I think that homage, that kind of respect and joy we have in the writers that we're working with as we're retelling our things, revising them, I think is one of the great things, and it certainly works well in this story. Yeah, did I answer your question at all, Ted?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in revisionist fiction is interesting because on the one hand, it should obviously stand on its own. In other words, you should not have to be a Poe scholar or know Gordon Pym, the narrative Gordon Pym, to enjoy this and understand the story. But yet, if you do know a little something about Poe, or if you've read the story or other Poe, it's just so much fun to see those little Easter egg type things pop up or whatever. Like for example, this is one of many examples. This is still early in the story, but the narrator says, I felt as if the shabby floor had opened up and I was falling. Steadying myself, swallowing another whiskey, I forcefully objected to Poe's suggestion, which sounded like a command as though he was in control of my actions. And then a bit later, he says, he repeated that he was offering me immortality, that my formless real-life adventures required his shaping mind, his powers of reverie and ratiocination, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, to become the kind of fantastic yet true tale that might work. But anyway, that term, and I'm butchering it, ratiocination, that's what Poe called his stories of detection. We call them stories of detection, but in his time period, that's the word he used instead of detection. Murders in the Rue Morgue, the Purloined Letter, the Gold Bug, all those detective stories. That's the term that he used, and it basically means the same thing, to use logic to sort out the answer to something or whatever. But again, these little bits and pieces of dialogue or direct quotes from the stories or whatever they might be are just really are fun. Again, if you have some familiarity with Poe, with these stories, and so on. So I don't know. Or Grant, I haven't got you in for a while. Do you have any reactions to any of that, or any thoughts on that technique of working in these little Easter eggs?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Brady did something like that in his piece. He said burned brightly at one point, and it just sounded very Hemingway-esque to me. So, so anyway, I like that in his essay. And then I've done that too, where like there's a line in Hammett that I just love. It's in one of his Continental Ops stories, and the detective says something like, the nameless detective says something like, and you're going to swing for this, or something like that, and you're going to swing, and then the last lines are 3 words, and he did. And I have used that at the end of a chapter. I love that so much. It just stayed in my consciousness, and it's like, I'm going to put that in right here. So yeah, I totally get that, where there's little, almost like memes, like little things that stay with you, and then you use them, and it's a kind of shout out. There's a line in Chandler, I might be in For All My Lovely, something about a black lake opened at my feet and I fell in, and I used something like that in one of my stories. I think I might have changed it a little bit and said it was cold, but it comes right out of Chandler. So these little allusions to think, like a little, like, I admire this writer, and here's a little touch. In my most recent story, I take a little bit from I love Joyce, and I take from The End of the Dead, with the snow falling softly, softly falling. I don't use those 4 words. I just use 2 of them, but it's a snowfall scene, and I'm like, here's my little shout out to Joyce, without being too too bloody obvious about it. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, yeah, I love what you're saying about that word. I don't know how to pronounce it either, but Brady.
Well, I looked it up at one point, but it didn't stick with me, So,
But yeah,
I had an English professor when I was in college. He used to say ratiocination, which I don't know how he got that out of that word.
yeah,
he's
I
probably
heard
much
the
closer than I
rat.
was. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
One of
it's
the things.
one of the fun things that
Well, I
Frank
think
does.
Brady was going to say something. Ted,
Oh,
can we?
sorry, Brady. Go ahead.
No. Well, just in drawing together several threads and going back in our conversation, but I think it's here in this story as well. Or my deduction would be that there's something deeply personal about being a reader. There's something deeply personal about being a writer, but the love of literature, the love of books, the love of story is, for some of us, so deeply compelling it becomes personal. And so Ted's experience with engaging with Mary Shelley, but I'm also in particular struck by the very profound way, the very personally profound way that people engage with Melville. Maybe, because I love Melville, I see it everywhere. But so many people have that kind of admiration, total absorption. Their lives have been changed by books, and it's in our consciousness. And sometimes we have to be in conversation with it. We have to tell our Melville story, or those lines or those images that Grant was just referring to come through. So yeah, I'm as always, I'm just wandering off down my own. But that's because I love Melville and Stern. Like, the idea to wander off is exactly what you need to do. So I can't even remember what we were talking about. But this a lot of this process, a lot of this writing, a lot of what we've been talking about today, I hate to say it in such a corny way, but it seems to come from love. Like, this something is so great, you cannot help but respond to it.
Right. No, I completely agree. Well, I'm going to backtrack a little bit here and not go where I was going to go for just a second, but because something I definitely wanted to get to was this idea that even though this is multiple layers of fiction and fiction on top of fiction and fantasy and blah, 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 there's just so many interesting little nuggets about life and real life. And one of the things that the story gets into on a couple different occasions is this idea that real life, as we think of it, memory of real life, is just as fictive as fiction is. We think back on some memory and try to recount it, and we inadvertently are fictionalizing it in that process. We're misremembering things. We're placing more emphasis on things that maybe were insignificant, but now they're significant in our memory. And that's a really interesting concept too, that we earlier in the podcast, this episode, we were talking about fiction and nonfiction as if they were, these fairly distinct things, these binaries. But are they really? I mean, they really occupy a very similar space when it comes to narrative and relating information and so forth. That's one of the ideas that this author gets at through this highly imaginative, fictive, story or whatever. I see you kind of nodding there, Brady. As that strike home to you too?
Oh yeah. Well, I just one connection to what you said. I think one of the great things about 12 Winters Journal is that it's narrative, right? What we're looking for, what the readers and the guy on the masthead is looking for is narrative in different forms. And so yeah, I was so profoundly struck by what you just said, that of course what we do is narrativize our lives. Our lives are random and chaotic, and probably if we look at them, they don't make much sense. But when we tell, I went for groceries and then I met a friend, and right then it's story, right? It's not memory. It's already something else. And what it is that very human thing, that really deep desire we have to tell stories, to make sense of things. Yeah. So I don't know where the line is between fiction and nonfiction, but as you say, it's a pretty slippery, hard to find line.
Right. Grant, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about about this because I had someone in my church say, Grant, I've been reading your detective stories, and you're such a generous person, but in your stories, they're so bleak, you know, and I'm like, and I was like, well, I don't necessarily see them that way, but um, I think there's a way in which I can't explain this, but someone said to me a long time ago that in my own work, there's a lot of sad resignation. And I think that's probably true. I think there's a lot of things I've repressed throughout my life, and then that manifests itself in my fiction. And I think one of the reasons I was so attracted to Raymond Chandler, why I love his work, is he elevated the detective story to a new place. But and I don't drink, so I'm not, you know, an alcoholic, and I'm not, you know, pointing fingers at those that are. But in Chandler's work, the world is so oppressive that the protection that his hero seeks is through alcohol, and that's part of the sad. There's a loneliness to Chandler that vibes with me for whatever reason. And I'm not a lonely person in real life, but I think I was lonely for a long time as a kid and an adolescent, and even until I met my wife. I mean, you know, all through college, all through undergrad. So I guess in terms of the love of literature, there's a way in which those themes or sensibilities, that's a whole different thing than what we've been talking about. But the vibe, the feelings of the Chandlerian universe spoke to me and still do in a way. And I think maybe that's part of the homage that uh, I'm paying respects to. I'm not sure, but I think that's part of the appeal of writing detective stories for me. There's a pyrrhic quality that the journey takes you somewhere, and at the end you die a little because it's you see things about humanity that aren't the most positive.
Right, right. Well, we've already kind of mentioned that the author works in subtly some issues regarding Poe and his time period and his, views about the South being right, justified in promoting the institution of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not a big part of the story, but again, it's subtly kind of worked in. And then this comment stood out to me too. He says, of course, I think this is his Poe character talking. Of course, but the public wants a fable. They crave the fantastic. At the same time, they want to believe it's all fact. They want reality as a story. And, we're living in this time where people are so anxious to believe things that are complete nonsense, and they're much more anxious to believe like some wild conspiracy theory than they are easily verifiable facts. They want this weirdness thing going on with the deep state or aliens or whatever it might be, and I think that's a really true statement. It worked into this highly fantastic, highly imaginative short story. Yeah, Grant, you're nodding there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that hits it on the head. That was the thing I was asking earlier. How do you get that double consciousness, that double voice quality? It's written in a way that sounds, older, but it's addressing our time today. And that's, that art, even it's obviously the stuff set in the past has to speak to us today. And that's a nice example of how to thread that into the narrative schema of the piece.
Right. Well, let me give Frank's contributor's note here before I forget to do that. Frank Meola has published work in a variety of forms and places, including New England Review and the New York Times. He frequently writes on American culture and history, most recently an essay on the complexities of Hispanic identity in America, based partly on his own experience. Several of his short stories have won or been finalists in fiction contests. His novel Clay was published in summer 2021, and he is at work on a new novel that juxtaposes the present and the 19th century, which he very much does in this story. He has an MFA from Columbia and a PhD from UCLA and teaches writing at NYU. He lives in Brooklyn, New York with his husband and their 2 cats. He has a website, Frank Meola, that's MEOLA -author.com. And if you go to his website, he's got, a place where you can see his publications. And he's actually published more nonfiction, and they seem to be of a sort of scholarly bent and in some really good places, and then a few short stories in addition to that novel. So really interesting writer and doing some really interesting work. When I first Googled him, there's someone with the exact same name whose obituary popped up, and I thought, oh no, not Frank. And luckily, or unluckily for that family, it was a different Frank Meola. But anyway, really interesting story. And I highly recommend, writers out there, playing with this idea of revisionist form. And like I said, a lot of my students who come into my courses have not really been familiar with the approach, and they certainly haven't tried it themselves. But boy, do they have some fun working with it. In my Shakespeare class for their final project, they have to pick one or more of the plays that we read and write a scene, revising it somehow or another. And again, it can be a prequel, a sequel, it can be modernizing. If you go to Shakespeare productions, one of the fun things they'll do is set, a particular play in a completely different, time period, turn it into a sci-fi story or something like that. And so it really unleashes, writers' creativity to work with this original text, but just have all kinds of fun. Now, I must emphasize, the legal department at 12 Winters wants me to emphasize that key to this is using material that's beyond copyright. You obviously would not want to take Hamilton or something and revise it, and try to publish it and make money off of it. You want to be using Poe, Shakespeare. Several of Hemingway's stories and novels have just recently come into the public, arena, past copyright. And Brady, you may know more specifics about that than I do. But not all of his stuff. It can get kind of complicated. But you certainly want to be working with uncopyrighted material if you plan to try to publish it, and particularly if you want to make money off of it. So plus, I think the fun of it is the reader should have some sense what the original was, even if they aren't intimately familiar with it. So it's fun working with something that most readers are going to have some familiarity with to begin with. Yeah. I think we're probably nearing the end of our listeners' patience with us, but let me turn it back to you guys for any final thoughts before I hit the stop record button. Brady, any final things you want to throw out there, or reflections you've had as we've been talking away here?
Well, there's a old saw, an old chestnut, and I think over the course of our conversation today, it's sort of been coming back to me. If you want to write something, keep reading. Read everything, and read it closely, read it well. I think there's some forces in our culture that work against our ability to concentrate and have the sort of patience that is required to read Poe now, or Melville now, or Wolfe or Faulkner. And so cultivate that patience and that time away from screens. But listen to our podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah, Grant?
No, not really. I thought Brady said it real well. I'm a big believer in feeding the lake, which I got from Stephen Schwartz, who was quoting Reese, and the idea that we're all artists feeding the lake of ideas. And so you borrow from that lake, and then you add to that lake, and other people come along and riff on what you're doing. And so for me, it's all one big community. And yeah, that's my thought on that.
There you go. Well, get a hold of Azure, loyal listeners and watchers. And we only barely touched on what's going on in this story. It's really a fun read, and check that out. And maybe check out one of our books while you're at it. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I had a good time as always. We'll get back together in a month or so. And of course, you working slobs will be gearing up for another school year. Of course, I've never stopped teaching. I just teach perpetually, just one class after another.
When I retire, I don't want to be retired in the way that you're retired.
Yeah, I'm terrible at retirement. I'm maybe the worst retiree in the history of retirees. Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, guys, I'm going to hit the stop record button, and we will see you on down the road.
Awesome.